Welcome to the Speaking of Women's Health CME podcast. This podcast is sponsored by an unrestricted grant by Astellas and Bayer in conjunction with Rush University, Plexus Communications, Advancing Health After Hysterectomy, and our nonprofit National Speaking of Women's Health. And you can find more information about this free CME program and upcoming other CME podcasts on menopausalearning.com. So I am so happy to be back in the Sunflower House with guest extraordinaire, good friend, incredible researcher and wonderful clinician and beloved to all who know him, Dr. James A. Simon. He's a clinical professor in the Department of OBGYN at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and he's done extensive research in the fields of menopause and hormone therapy and osteoporosis and sexual dysfunction. He's a past president of the North American Menopause Society, and he is the proud father of 3 lovely daughters, and he now has 3 grandsons. So we're kind of like the reverse. I have 3 sons, and I'm going to be going on my 3rd grandchild, 2 girls and a boy. So welcome to the Sunflower CME House, Jim. Tell us a little bit more about you and what your current practice and research interests are.
Thank you, Holly. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. My private practice, which is separate from George Washington University, is called Intim Medicine Specialists, INTIM Medicine Specialists, and we're located about 5 blocks from the White House in Washington, D.C., where we focus on the intersection between menopause, sexual function, and those metabolic changes that occur with aging in menopause, like weight gain and osteoporosis, as well as their downstream effects on cardiometabolic health, etc. And I see the entire field, as I've outlined it, as all connected in an evolutionary context. And we'll have to save that discussion for another day, Holly. But it's really amazing to me that it seems all connected, that excess body fat affects our bones, affects our temperature regulation, our sex life, etc., and that we are now unraveling the connections, the hormonal and peptide connections between all of those states.
Well, it certainly is an exciting field, time to actually be in the field of women's health, midlife, menopausal women's health. When I started in the field, we certainly knew that women had hot flashes, so-called vasomotor symptoms, but there wasn't really very much understanding of the pathobiology of this. And now we have a better understanding of some of the mechanisms of action of these neurokinin 1 and neurokinin 3 receptor antagonists. This grant, this non-restricted grant we have to educate doctors and nurses and APPs and health clinicians. We've had a series of lectures, and you gave a wonderful lecture with all the slides on this topic that I encourage people to go to on menopausalearning.com. We've had interactive town halls, and we'll have some more. And we're also having events for women to help our lay women understand this. But focusing on prescribers, physicians, in terms of talking about the mechanism of action of these NK1 and NK2 receptor antagonists, do you want to talk a little bit about this peptide system and how they affect the hypothalamus and how they modulate our central body temperature and why this area gets so hypertrophied in menopausal women?
Sure, I'll try and make it very simple. So all of us humans are homeotherms, meaning we like our temperature to be relatively restricted within a very narrow degree structure. Everyone knows that when they're out on the tennis court in the heat of summer, they do a lot of sweating. And if they happen to be in Cleveland in the wintertime where Holly is, it can be quite cold. And if they're not appropriately dressed, they shiver to warm themselves up to again keep their body temperature within this narrow range. Well, when hormones, and in particular estrogen, goes down with menopause, that close temperature regulation system goes out of whack because estrogen is a piece of keeping that therapeutic or that so-called thermoneutral zone nice and wide. That is to say, we can tolerate it when it's 65. We can tolerate it when it's 75, even though we feel much better when it's 68 to 72. And when that estrogen goes down, and by the way, the exact same thing happens to men if they become hypogonadal, the range in which humans feel comfortable gets more narrow. Along with that, in the brain, there are certain nerves now and their secretion products that we now know control or are involved in the control of that thermoneutral zone, and they become hypertrophied. And the specific one that we're talking about is neurokinin 3, and we now know and have in development a few drugs that are meant to antagonize this excessive production of neurokinin 3 and the hypertrophy of the neurokinin 3 neurons that we believe, and there's good data on now, control our thermoneutral zone. And when women who are menopausal have temperatures that are normally within the thermoneutral zone and now fall outside the thermoneutral zone because their estrogen is low, they have hot flashes, night sweats, disturbed sleep, and all the other things that go along with those menopausal symptoms. So we're here today to talk about these new developments for therapeutic agents, two of them in fact, that are going to come to market, or we hope that they will, pending FDA approval, to modulate that neurokinin 3 hypertrophy and excess in hopes of completely non-hormonal control of vasomotor symptoms due to menopause.
Yeah, that is so exciting because since half of all women suffer from vasomotor symptoms and they can be quite disruptive, affecting sleep, work productivity. If you look at the United States labor statistics of women around age 51, the median age of menopause, dramatically dropping off the workforce. I mean, this is a pharmacoeconomic, health crisis, and we've already got a labor crisis as it is. And the fact that it's not physiologically good to have these symptoms, besides the fact that they're embarrassing and can be problematic. I'm sure that when these agents come out, they'll be labeled for what they've been studied, which is going to be in postmenopausal women. But I'm just thinking of patients I see who have these disruptive vasomotor symptoms that aren't yet menopausal, that are perimenopausal. I even wonder how much of it has to do with the aging brain, because I'll see a lot of perimenopausal women on an adequate dose of hormonal contraception for contraception, way more estrogen than we would give with menopausal formulations, taking it continuously, not off and on to irritate the brain, and still have these symptoms. Do you think that aging has a role in this besides just the withdrawal of the gonadal hormones?
So I don't know, but following up on your specific example, it may be that those women on birth control pills while they're actually getting lots of estrogen, they're getting a lot more progestogen. And it may be that their estrogen receptors are so downregulated or turned off by that very dominant form or forms of contraceptive progestogen in their birth control pill that the estrogen just doesn't work very well. And the example that I would give outside of the brain or hot flashes would be our use of birth control pills to control heavy menstrual bleeding. Certainly, we would all agree that if they were getting a lot of estrogen, they'd have a lot of endometrial proliferation and bleeding, but the progestogen is so strong in our contraceptives that they basically have endometrial atrophy. I wonder if there's something similar going on in the brain or in this candy neuron system that could be similar, leading, for example, to hot flashes and night sweats, even if those women are on continuous birth control pills. My take, Holly, is that it's not so much an age-related phenomenon in the perimenopause, but as we have good information demonstrating dysregulation of the estrogen progesterone hypothalamic axis in the perimenopause, as those women's brains try ever so hard to eke out the last few menstrual cycles, that they have overshoot of their estrogen with high estrogen and then falling estrogen and resultant bleeding, etc., leading to perhaps a triggering or dysregulation of the whole system during the perimenopause rather than aging per se.
Well, we know that infusions of substance P and neurokinin B can certainly trigger vasomotor symptoms, and we certainly have lots of clinical examples of substances, environments, alcohol, uncomfortable situations that can certainly trigger it. What do you think the most likely patients that you see in your practice that you'll be thinking about a new class of medications that are not hormonal, that have this mechanism of action of being candy neuron receptor antagonists to help settle down and widen this thermostat in the brain?
Yeah, so I think most of us are most excited, in fact, for this class of compounds, for our patients who cannot or will not use estrogens, and those would certainly be our breast cancer survivors, our endometrial cancer survivors, certain patients with estrogen receptor positive cancers of other sorts. There are some brain cancers that have estrogen receptors. In some studies, even melanomas have been demonstrated to have estrogen receptors, where because we're not sure whether a patient can or cannot safely use estrogen following those cancers, or where they're absolutely contraindicated, this kind of new therapeutic approach will be so dramatically beneficial for those patients. Obviously, there are lots of women that you and I see every day that are great candidates for hormone therapy, but refuse or prefer not to use it for whatever reason. They too would be good candidates for these treatments. And then we who see a lot of menopausal patients who have been referred and finally end up in our offices, who cannot tolerate some of the other off-label non-hormonal treatments, will benefit from the availability of these two new therapies that are in development.
And can you give us the names of these two? And do they both affect NK1 and NK3, or alternate, or how are they similar and different?
Sure. So the first product to the FDA is a product from the Astellas pharmaceutical company, and it's a brand name I don't know, but maybe someone does. But its chemical name is fezolinetant, Fezo linitant, line, Linetant, fezolinetant. And fezolinetant is a specific NK3 receptor antagonist. And my understanding is that the FDA should give us an approval or a denial and a label one way or the other sometime in mid-February, which would be 2 or 3 weeks from now, which would be very exciting news for us in the prescribing public.
Yes, just for our audience, we're speaking today. It's January 29th, 2023. Yes. Go on. Thanks.
Yeah, so a few weeks from now, we should find out about fezolinetant. The next product that's in development, which is in phase 3 trials, but not into the FDA yet, is a related compound called elinzanetant, and it's a Bayer Pharmaceuticals product, and it's being developed for the same indication, vasomotor symptoms due to menopause, and it has additional action in the brain on the receptor 1, the neurokinin 1 receptor, where it also acts as an antagonist. And the exact benefit of that receptor is unclear in a clinical population, but it's thought to be beneficial for sleep and mood, but both of those are yet to be documented in a large clinical trial. And so it too hopefully will be an alternative to fezolinetant should it become FDA approved. And then we'll have 2 tools in our non-hormonal toolbox for vasomotor symptoms.
So the one that's not in front of the FDA, elinzanetant, also sometimes people refer that in research as NT-814. That is both selective NK1 and NK3, whereas phazo or fezolinetant, which we're expecting potentially sooner, is an NK3 antagonist. So can you tell us anything about the pharmacology or distribution, how this medication is cleared, how a clinician might in the future anticipate dosing it for vasomotor symptoms?
So I think we need to wait a little bit for what the FDA tells us on that. But the likelihood is that both of these products will be dosed as a single daily oral. They're all both oral preparations. They hopefully will be available at least a single dose, perhaps multiple doses. But the answer is, I think we really need to wait until the final approval and what the FDA and the manufacturers agree on. I would say parenthetically that it's quite important that we remember, we being all of us, remember that most medications, as well as our food, get metabolized in our livers. And when when these products, like almost all oral medications, go through the gastrointestinal system, they go first to the liver, where they're either biotransformed or metabolized. And it is, in fact, very important that new drugs be safe, because they go to the liver first and then are metabolized there. And so it becomes very important that all drug development, and that the FDA is clearly all over this, demonstrate safety as it relates to liver function with chronic dosing. Remember, these products are likely to be used for some period of time. While you and I grew up in medicine, Holly, at a time when we thought hot flashes were a relatively short phenomenon, we all know now from multiple trials that demonstrate many women, perhaps as many as 15% of women, may have their hot flashes and night sweats for as long as 7 to 10 years. So obviously any medication that would be used for them has got to be safe over the long term.
Oh, I even have women in my practice in their 90s. If they stop any of their therapy, they will get recurrent flashes. And I saw a woman in her late 70s the other day who didn't have hot flashes, but she had an ovarian thecal tumor making androgens. And so she underwent oophorectomy and was sent to me because of horrific hot flashes, since she lost that source of, androgen hormones. So
I remember a study done by the late Dr. Freddie Cronenberg, who did some pivotal work on vasomotor symptoms in menopausal hot flashes, where she documented a patient who had objectively measured. These were hot flashes where they put this older woman in a temperature chamber so they could measure changes in her skin temperature, and she had objectively measured hot flashes for 44 years.
Wow. That's a lot. That's awfully exhausting. And I think it's...
I can't imagine.
Yes.
I cannot imagine.
I think a lot of times it's underestimated how much, midlife women suffer. A lot of patients come to me saying they're told, oh, it's normal, it's natural, or everybody goes through it. I mean, not everybody does. Not everyone's brain certainly is wired to flash. But those people that do, I think, have significant morbidity for sure. And anything that we can do, I think, is really important. It's incumbent upon all of us. Getting back to that liver aspect, I'll see women in the office who don't want to take oral estrogen because they're worried about their liver. Now, they may be overweight. They may have a fatty liver, which in women can certainly lead to non-alcoholic cirrhosis, especially if they have diabetes. They may drink alcohol, take over-the-counter Tylenol, which, can cause lots of problems if mixed with maximal doses of acetaminophen. And so a lot of them might prefer sometimes to take things transdermally. So both of these agents are oral. Are there any potential hepatic signals? Have any of the studies reported any significant serious adverse events?
So I think that you've asked a number of questions there, and some of those questions are not absolutely clear to me, but I think that it's fair to say that fezolinetant in the phase 3 data did show in a small number of individuals a transient, I want to emphasize transient, change in liver function tests during the phase 3 trials. Now, how severe that is, how long-lasting that is, whether the FDA thinks that's important or not, I think that all remains to be determined. If it's a small number of individuals and it's only transient, I don't think that there'll be liver testing that'll be required. But if it's more than that, we'll have to wait for the FDA to decide. I was an investigator on the phase 2 elinzanetant trial, the so-called Switch-1 trial, which should be published in menopause in the next couple of weeks. And we didn't see any transient elevations in liver function tests, but I'd hasten to say that phase 2 trials are much smaller That is to say, the number of participants, many fewer than phase 3, and we'll have to wait on that compound until the results of the phase 3 trials are available to know whether or not there's any liver signal for it or not. So we're not quite there yet, but the answer is we're going to get there pretty soon.
When I started in the menopausal field over 30 years ago, I remember prescribing the old drug that was available even before the FDA was available, the old ester test, which is not available. It's a esterified estradiol with methyl testosterone orally. And I remember my endocrine colleagues getting on me, oh, you got to be worried about the liver. You're taking oral methyl testosterone. And so, I would dutifully check the liver functions every 3 months, then once a year. And now I don't even do that anymore. So I think with any new drug, there's got to be concerns about signals and people knowing how to appropriately report. On the other hand, I just medically think that when people are suffering and we've got new options, especially that we understand the pathophysiology behind it, it certainly makes it, imperative for all of us to get educated. And we will be having other CME podcasts, and once we get that publication, if I don't note it verbally in our future CME Speaking of Women's Health podcast, certainly we will have it on menopauselearning.org, and that's a really rich site that has free CME and lots of recorded lectures, ways to interact with us. Now, I wanted to also ask you, besides treating hot flashes, do you think there could be other improvements in other somatic symptoms observed with these neurokinin receptor antagonists?
We'll be back after a quick break.
Hey, quick question for you. Are you someone who wants to be fit, healthy, and happy? And what if I told you could get your dream body by simply just listening to a podcast? I'm Josh.
And I'm KG, and we are the hosts of the Fit, Healthy, and Happy podcast.
Listen, we get it. Fitness isn't easy. Carbs, no carbs.
Just stop, okay? It doesn't have to be that complicated. And that's why we made this podcast. We get straight to the facts so you can become your best you.
So the way to check us out is click the link in the show notes or search Fit, Healthy, and Happy podcast on any of the major podcast platforms. We'll see you soon.
I think that's $1 million question, Holly. As I've mentioned, as it relates to elinzanetant, because it's a dual action antagonist at both the neurokinin 3 and the neurokinin 1 receptor, it may have some non-vasomotor symptom effects as it relates to mood and sleep. But again, I hasten to say those need to be investigated further. I also think that we generally are just beginning to tease out the actions in the whole KNDy neuron system, KNDy being kisspeptin neurokinin system, and that includes the neurons we've been discussing on this podcast, but also includes the kisspeptin system, which is absolutely integral to control of GnRH and its downstream effects on the gonad. In this case, it would be the ovary in the female. And let's not forget, because this is quite important, that even after women go through menopause and cease menstruation, the stroma of the ovary maintains a lot of activity producing androgens, which in nearly everyone can be converted to estrogens in one tissue or another. And it is likely that spillover to the kisspeptin neurons could in fact have an effect on menstrual function or androgen production in menopausal women, or other off-target effects that we just haven't discovered yet. I would also say that once there is an FDA-approved product for hot flashes, as we've been discussing, and I presume is likely to happen, there might be other compounds specifically targeting neurokinin 1, neurokinin 3, the kisspeptin system more generally, etc., because we now know that it can be done. And so rather than attempting to use a downstream therapy, estrogen or testosterone are downstream therapies, and they affect literally most of the tissues in the human body. This would be a way to specifically target the neuropeptide system in the brain for other actions. We're seeing that in sexual medicine, where the dopamine receptor system is being targeted for sexual desire. We're seeing that in weight loss, where the neural peptides of gastrointestinal origin that feed back to the brain and say, you're full, you're not hungry, you don't need to eat, or you should not be eating, are being used to great effect for weight loss. And I would also hasten to say, although it's too complicated for a podcast, I barely can keep it together in my slides, that all of these systems are connected. All of these systems are intimately connected. We eat poorly when we don't sleep well, choosing carbohydrates with rapid onset of raising glucose levels to absolutely horrible effect in our bodies. So that's sleep and eating. When we're full, we're less likely to feel desire for other desires to fill ourselves up. That's my take on the old story, no one has sex on Thanksgiving. So if you're completely full of turkey and dressing and two kinds of pie, apple and pumpkin, you're too satiated to have much in the way of sexual desire. And by the way, this is all documented. And let me just say this just as a teaser to our audience. We now know that there are certain inherent or inherited metabolic problems in children that cause incessant eating. They can't stop eating. And the treatment to stop them from eating, from being full or satiated with food, acts in the brain in exactly the same place where we are using medications to stimulate sexual desire.
Fascinating.
So there's this balance between desire for food and desire for sex, and my take on that is it's all evolutionarily derived, so that when we humans were roaming the earth as hunter-gatherers and there wasn't enough food, we would have the drive to hunt for food to eat so that women would have enough calories and fat for reproductive function. And once there was enough calorie for reproductive function, the desire would switch from hunting and gathering to desire to procreate and make babies and have sex. And this all makes perfect sense in a general evolutionary concept. And now we seem to have the connection actually in the brain. Fascinating.
It certainly is fascinating. My son is oldest son is a molecular medicine PhD and geneticist, and he is so entranced with all the obesity data and the GLP-1 receptors that he said in 20 years he doesn't think we're going to have any obesity. So that would be nice. No obesity, no hot flashes, great sex lives. We may be just getting ourselves out of business at that point, right? That would be something.
Well, it's very exciting as a clinical investigator who does research on all of these areas. It's fascinating to me just how intertwined they all are. And as we, you and I, and much of our audience take care primarily of women, how both the weight and hot flash and sexual desire are all connected, as well as how those affect our intimate partners. And this is how our survival has continued, and also how our future quality of life continues as post-reproductive women and their intimate partners.
Well, this has just been a fascinating CME interview, and I'm going to have you back in the Sunflower House for our lay podcast, as well as more CME podcasts, because you are just a wealth of experience and intellect and good humor and great grace. So I really thank Dr. James Simon. And give us your website and your practice again.
Sure, the practice is called Intimedicine Specialists. It's www.intimedicine.com. INTIMMEDICINE, intimedicine.com.
And to our listeners, to remind you to claim your free CME, please go on menopauselearning.com. I am your host, Dr. Holly Thacker. I am the Executive Director of Speaking of Women's Health, and I want to thank you for listening. You've been listening to the CME podcast of Speaking of Women's Health. I'm Dr. Thacker, who has been here with Dr. James Simon. And you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, RadioInfluence.com, any place you catch your podcast. So thanks for joining us in the Sunflower House. Remember, be strong, be healthy, and be in charge.